Hello everybody, welcome to today's webinar. Really great to have you with us. As always with these events, we're just waiting for a few more people to join us, so please bear with us for 30 seconds or so as we wait for a number of people to join, and then I will be quick to welcome our brilliant guests on this panel and event today. So you are at the Planning Driven by Data event, so you're at the right place. We've got a number of topics to cover with you all today. I know we have quite a number of our customers on this call, so hello to all of our familiar faces and friends in the Panintelligence community, and also those of you who haven't been on an event like this before. You're up for a treat with these guys who've got some fantastic knowledge when it comes to data and some brilliant insights around how we can approach that from a perspective of planning, running our organisations, and thinking about perhaps some of the ways we can do things differently. So thank you for joining us. We can see there's a few more people arriving, so we'll just bear with that for a couple more seconds and then I will kick off. So hopefully you can hear us okay. There is a chat option. If you haven't used GoToWebinar before, you'll see there's a chat section. Do use that if you want to ask any questions during the event at all. There's also a Q&A panel. We do have a moderator, Sam, who's silently in the background making sure that we pick up those questions as we go. So put some questions in there. Please feel free to ask anybody on this event today any questions that you may have. So I think we'll kick off. So just for everybody that's joined since I've started talking, you're at the Planning Driven by Data event. And I'm just going to introduce our guests and let them say a little bit more about themselves before we start the event. So firstly, Judith, who on my screen is in the bottom left. I'm never quite sure where people are on their screens. The people move around on Zoom and Teams, but she's in the bottom left today. Judith heads up the business development at Simple Usability. It's a Yorkshire headquartered behavioural research company. I'm reading my screen to my left, so forgive me. Which helps brands understand the needs of their customers. Simple Usability works across websites, mobile app, print, voice, UI, and a lot more, with a focus on user experience, customer experience, and behavioural research. So welcome, Judith. Really good to have you here. I'm also going to introduce Paul and finally my colleague Ken. So Paul Sheppard, who's on my bottom left of my screen today, is the CEO of Simitive, a partner of Panintelligence, one of our customers. So thank you for joining us today, Paul. You're a SaaS software for universities, a solution that saves institutions time and money for managing essential processes to provide insights that motivate people to focus on their efforts to achieve their key business priorities, which in turn ultimately improves productivity, performance, efficiency, change. Your solution is just over I think this is right, tell me if I'm wrong, 60 of the 132 universities, that sounds like a lot we have here, in the UK, and a few international ones as well. So thank you so much, Paul, a real pleasure to have you with us. And finally, Ken, my colleague and co-founder at Panintelligence, who's a CTO and co-founder of the business, and started to build it in the bedroom, probably one he's actually sat in right now, frankly, many years ago when we kicked Panintelligence off. I'm sure at some point he'll show and tilt his screen up and show the squadron of Airfix kits above his head. But an amazing, colleague and friend, and a real expert on all things data and business intelligence. So three brilliant people joining us today. So before we kick off and get into some Q&A and some questions, it'd be really good, if anything that I haven't introduced you around, just to hear a little bit more from perhaps if we start with you, Judith, about what interests you in this area of data and planning, and what are the things that you think you and Simple Usability bring to the table on that subject?
Yeah, gladly. Thanks, Sandra. So for us as a behavioural research consultancy, we generally work with data in many forms. So it could be analytics data when it comes to a website. It could be app store ratings and reviews. It could be sales data. So data kind of comes into us, and generally the role that we play is adding context to that data and converting data into insight. So the data indicates what's happening, and generally where we add value is by and the whys of the behavior that's reflected in the data. So for us, it's that translation from data to insight and to actionable recommendations. So, I think our perspective might be slightly different, because for us, that data exists in so many different forms, and it's how we give context to it to aid understanding and generally help businesses improve experiences across a range of channels.
Thanks, Judith. And I think that kind of moving data into action is a really important subject, and many which I think people that I know on this event today is part of that challenge. Once we make that data available and visible, is how do we affect real change? So yeah, I'd be really interested to hear insights on that. So thank you, Judith. Paul, just again a little bit more from you about sort of your world and how data sort of features as an importance to both your community, your customers, and your business, and where Simitive play in that.
Well, thanks, Andrew. So our software collects vast amounts of data across, as Andrew said, somewhere around about 50% plus of the UK universities. So whilst we collect operational data that enable efficiency, having done that for 7 years, we've collected a fair amount of the stuff. So it's quite useful now to have a tool like Panintelligence, which is why I work with them to help universities make, I guess, what we call data-informed decisions to meet some of the challenges that have been fairly much in the news lately.
Thanks, Paul. And I think having a kind of use case of universities who, like you say, are major collectors of for many years of large volumes of data, I think is really interesting to hear how you've managed both those large data sets, but also making that useful to those different stakeholders in the organisation to take action on. So I'm sure we'll cover that in a bit more detail. Ken, you talk about data all the time, but where do you think Panintelligence sits in this sort of world of enablement for planning and data insights?
The good thing for us is every software application out there exists primarily to collect data, and people spend a lot of money collecting data for good reason, because it's the observation that allows you to apply actions to your future events, both the good and the bad. And really, we'll get into this, I'm sure. It's the underutilization of that is something that's always been at the heart of what we do. So I think when we first started this business, Andrew, we came up with a strapline of enabling better decisions. I think it simplified at various points to enabling decisions. And really the lovely phrase that's become synonymous these days is businesses being data driven. And it's a really nice philosophy for people to have. We've collected this data, we've got observations about what's worked and what hasn't worked in the past. How do we simplify that, understand it, and make sure that we work in a better way in the future? And really it boils down to that simple thing. I'm not trying to say we don't need to talk for 2 hours, by the way, now at all, because there's lots to talk about. But really, fundamentally, doing the simple things is just really, really important, and we'll hopefully get to the bottom of how we work and which bits benefit us in the next couple of hours. That's what I'm looking forward to. And
I know we've got a lot of questions to cover, and I hope you don't mind us sort of kicking off with the first one, because sometimes it is about the basics, and we've talked about behavioural data, we've talked about operational data, Judith and Paul, and there are lots of different types of data, huge amounts of variance in the quality, quantity, velocity, type of information. So what is data, and what does data mean to you in a context for what you do in your organisations? Perhaps, Paul, if we could start with you, is that all right?
Yeah, sure. Give me a difficult question.
Sorry.
Data to us, it's a bit like, as Ken referred to, it is what we do. So whilst we've got some wonderful applications that enable people to see stuff and do stuff, it's all data. So in our world, when we're looking at what academics do in a university, we pull data from the number of students, we pull from student satisfaction, we pull from research outputs, we pull from employability prospects, we pull from the amount of work academics do in teaching and research. And that's all great, because you can enable the planning bit. So we can make sure the right academics are in the right place at the right time, hopefully. But this is exactly what Ken was saying. That's all great. So that might be efficient, but adding the analysis of that data to become effective is something slightly different. So yes, it's vast quantities of data from lots of different sources, lots of different types. Oh, and it includes financial data if you're looking at the results out the other end, and trying to make sense of that mix, particularly in an environment where actually in universities half the systems don't even talk to each other. So there's a few challenges there as well.
Yeah, so that's sort of that going back to the basics of the simple challenge just being, where is my data? How do I get to it? And can I bring that all together before we even get to insight and decision making is actually first base, it feels. And it sounds like you're doing a huge amount of work around that very effectively. Judith, I think it's sometimes that kind of qualitative, quantitative mix of data, and some things are not always binary or in simple boxes. You're dealing with more qualitative data, I think, than perhaps many organisations. So tell me about some of your sort of data mix and the challenges of that, really.
Yeah, so you know, as an organisation that generally works, as you say, very much kind of more on the qualitative side of things, you know, we've generally got comfort in large amounts of data. And so I think, you know, we often get that pushback of, you know, what's sample size? And sample size in UX is, you know, probably a topic that could create a whole webinar of its own for another 2 hours. You know, it's kind of a hotly contested subject. So kind of UX behavioural research, it's not necessarily about gaining huge sample sizes. It's about using existing data points, really mining into the hows and whys of that behaviour. And what we find is that generally, you know, through doing reasonably small sample studies, you get a thematic analysis and you kind of understand where those different attitudes, behaviours congregate quite quickly. So it's not about huge swathes of data. It's very much about just asking the right questions. And critically for us, it's about gathering evidence over opinion. You know, so this is something that sits within the government digital service kind of best practice guidance. You know, opinion is generally flawed. You know, when we seek someone's opinion, there's a whole range of reasons why they give us the answer that we do. If we actually get evidence of how someone behaves, then that's a completely different thing altogether. So for us, it's about you know, very much qualitative, but just observing what a natural interaction with a particular product or service looks like, and then using that as a platform for, you know, a really good quality interview to really get into the nitty-gritty of the behaviour. And you know, the key word is actionable recommendations. That's what our clients are looking for. It's kind of taking all of that and answering that so what question. I mean, what do I do with it now?
And I'm fascinated in that kind of challenge, really. You know, you've got the quantitative, and then you do those in-depth interviews, and there's lots of different ways in which people answer questions, and grouping those into buckets that can be, you know, cohorts or something that you can use to say the majority of. How do you manage that challenge? What is it? What advice would you give to people that are thinking, yeah, I've got all this research data, or I think, Paul, you said you're also tapping into research data, often a big unlocked pot of qualitative information. How do you tap into that as you know, you've got a lot of experience in that?
So a whole mix, really. So some of it is straight funding tracking against research and bringing it back in, which we use API technology and still spreadsheets in some cases to then create it in a state that can be analyzed. But then you also have qualitative research output, which is different again. So there is a vast store of research in various systems in this country, and extracting the bits that are relevant is more the challenge. It's kind of back to Judith's point, the qualitative bit. So fine, there's a paper that took 4 years to write that is 1,800,000 words, but actually you're probably not going to go through all that in one go. You're trying to look for some contextual pieces that have meaning to whatever the analysis you're doing is, and that is a challenge.
Thanks, Paul, and the same to you, Judith, as well, really, on that point. What's your approach to that challenge?
So you know, we always come at it from the profile of the end user, the end consumer, the end customer, and you know, when we deal with personas, marketing segments, you know, as marketeers, we want to make our lives as simple as possible, and kind of putting people into defined segments or cohorts, you know, that's a heuristic for us to be able to kind of, you know, get a huge audience and deal with it more efficiently. What we try to do is kind of mine down to what the behavioural differences are across different groups. So it could be you've got 6 different segments, but actually they may behave in a very similar way, you know, depending on what stage they are in a customer journey. So it's about really understanding the nuances of behavior, what sets someone apart, what makes them similar, and just being able to, again, you know, just for ease of creating that actionable insight, what is the best way to truly understand what makes someone different, but also what makes them similar. So our behavioural personas are generally much richer in nature than, for example, a marketing persona, because we're looking at what those touch points are. And, you know, again, a complete tangent, but again, you know, a really fascinating subject is what that behaviour looks like across lots of different touch points, and all the data that's generated by, you know, different touch points along a customer journey. You know, you are quickly at risk of data overload. So it's just coming down to those, you know, the customer touch points, the behavioural touch points, what influences, what doesn't, and really trying to make something that is really quite complex, quite simple. And by doing that with the research participants, getting that kind of narrative and those anecdotal quotes, you know, customers think about things very simply. We make things difficult because we have access to all this data. But when you speak with a customer or a user or a consumer, for them it's really quite simple. And so that's a really useful device, you know, seeing that evidence, seeing those videos firsthand, it kind of brings a refreshing clarity to it.
Thanks, Judith. And I think there's probably something that many organisations wrestle with, just trying to identify, like you say, those touch points that you can pin a sort of actionable insight to, that therefore you can treat or deal with or be prompted to react to if you understand that, because you've categorised it, like you said, put some cohort around it. So no, and I know that's a real sort of domain area of expertise for you guys. So, you know, I'm sure if anybody on this call is looking for, you know, support with that kind of understanding behavioural insight and working out how you deal with that type of kind of analysis, you know, please do contact Judith. It's certainly, you know, an interesting area that I think you can give a lot of support around. Ken, I know that we've sort of talked about kind of operational sort of data that sits in lots of systems and collecting more, you know, qualitative or sort of behavioural data. We deal with all sorts of Panintelligence sensor data, which can be, you know, looking at things like footfall monitoring and even kind of facial recognition software with some of our partners. I'm just wondering what trends and patterns you're seeing in sort of data collection and growth right now that are worth us understanding, you know, what's coming and what's really really the next wave of data we should all be tuning into as an area for insight.
I think people generally are being switched on by, you know, what the data can do for them. I've written down a couple of things from Judith and Paul there, which I think are really interesting. So the evidence over opinion, where you see something as exciting, I do get excited by data, I am that sad, is when you're able to either overturn or you're able to provide a qualitative measurement which actually allows people to understand what their opinion and why their opinion matters. So those are the 2 times when you're doing things where people literally will fall off their seat or actually quite often start an argument. And that's the bit where we get excited, you know, and it's beyond the spreadsheet. And I think a lot of people see that spreadsheet as the end point, but really it's what happens after you put the data into the spreadsheet is really, really important. Does it drive activity? Does it drive conversation in the first place? Does it provide the challenges that you want it to provide? And does it lead to those actionable changes as we go through? Because to quote one of my developers, you know, data for me is just a bunch of stuff, and it can be out there. It's how we pull it together and how we derive meaning from it, which does allow people to understand what we think about it and challenge our own opinions as well as other people's opinions. And it's that enriching of data which is becoming more and more important. So moreover, and I've been in business intelligence for sort of 25 years, we used to have a database, and there'd be some Excel spreadsheets, and there'd be something else. And then the world of big data happened, and we won't, if you think you can get into things for hours, we won't get into the debate for what big data actually is. But what it really means is we've got access to data sources that we never had access to before. So in the world of retail, we can bring in weather data, we can bring in commercial data, we can look at what's happened over the last 12 months and bring in all sorts of other data sources. It's how we enrich that. And my favorite word, I think you mentioned it earlier, Judith, as well, is context. Because without the context, data doesn't have any meaning. And without any meaning, you're not asking people to do anything about it. So it becomes something that looks pretty and is like, it's interesting. And you see people, it's like when you see them walking around the zoo, they've seen all these creatures before. They walk around and it's interesting to see them and having a nice day out. But that's not what we want to do with the data. We want to really, really challenge their thinking. Where they're right, give them then the emphasis and the ability to make change and say, no, I've got some empirical evidence now, I'm going to act upon this. Where they're wrong, be challenged and actually change that. And it's that constant cycle through any planning event where data becomes very, very important. Because the first projects that anyone runs are rubbish. Things will go wrong, but we've got to learn from it and then go through a cyclical cycle of, okay, what did we learn on the last project? Let's make sure we don't make the same mistakes again and again and again. And the more we repeat that by collecting the data, learning from the data and making change, the better and better our projects, our planning, our software, everything we do becomes. And that's really the benefit of the data. And as you're saying, Sandra, there's data all over the place at the moment, and it's about spending the time enriching that data, pulling it together, and making sure it does drive those actionable insights, which becomes really, really important. Easier said than done sometimes, but that's what we should all strive to do.
I think that bringing the data together and enriching it, and the ways in which we sort of help with the directions of travel on that can be an area that we really like to help on, I think would be fair to say, because there are lots of options for how we bring those data sets together, but also how we categorize or improve the tagging of that data so it can be used in a useful, meaningful way quickly. I think there's a lot of ways in which, lots of flexibilities in ways in which we can do that, I think, with people. And again, I think if that's an area that people are listening to and wanting to dig into in a bit more detail, let us know, because it's not always, like Ken said, it's not always the easiest challenge, but it's a valuable one to be starting with, I think, at the end of the day. I've got some questions here which kindly we've had prepared for us, so I better ask them, otherwise I'm going to get in trouble with our team who have put all the time and effort in putting this together. So I'm going to stop selfishly asking the questions I want to ask. I've got one here which is specific to the agenda for this event, which is how important is data planning in any project specifically? And I don't know if you've got any examples that you want to talk about, but I just wondered if perhaps we could start, Judith, with you this time, if that's all right.
Yeah, I mean, without data, without some form of insight, you're working with assumption and you're working with hypotheses. So in the absence of anything, assumption and hypotheses is a starting point. And then I think it's very much incumbent on you to find those data sources, do the primary research, the secondary research, whatever that may look like, to either support the hypothesis or completely debunk it. So it's absolutely vital. I can't think of a decision that would be made without a starting point that included some form of data gathering or data generation. There's a statistic which just kind of blows my mind every time I tell it, but 95% of products and services fail, which is phenomenal. But the things that we see that actually that's in such a small percentage of everything that's being worked on. So think about all those products and services that don't make it all the way to market, or don't succeed in market. And that's because generally they don't understand the market in which they're operating. they don't necessarily understand the audience that they're being pitched to. So there's lots of ways in which, you know, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure if you don't necessarily have some basis for making those decisions at the outset. So it's vital. I think it comes back to how you classify data, and you know what data you have within your control, or certainly that you can gather to help make those decisions.
95% is terrifying. And I've not heard that before, but I think what a powerful statistic. I think we forget that one. I think it's just shows you, like you say, how much we don't see really of the energy that is spent on trying to realise products and services. I think my question would be, how much is enough? How do we know when we've got enough information to base a decision? I mean, how long's a piece of string? I'm asking a really awful question of you right now, but I just wondered what advice or what thoughts do you have around when do we know we've got, you know, enough information to start making useful, meaningful decisions?
Well, that's really tricky, and I think it depends entirely on, you know, essentially your market, you know, the product, the service. I think, you know, within software development, with the principle of agile, you know, I think that approach, and rather than getting to perfection straight away, you know, the idea of having kind of cycles where you can bring something to market, or you're able to kind of bring something for, you know, review, read further research, whatever that is, but basically the finished product, that MVP principle, constantly developing and testing and iterating and building it back in. You know, as I said, that's, you know, kind of agile software development, but it has application across everything that we do. You know, don't think that you have to get it right absolutely first time, but think about it in more manageable chunks. Test, iterate, improve, and move forward. So, yeah, it's like politicians' answer for it.
No, it's perfect, right? It's that continuous cycle of needing data validation all the way through. So trying not to have all the data to then make the decision, but having enough to get that first solution out into some kind of shape to get some more data back, feedback to then go in. So it's, I think there's, I suppose, a continuous cycle of asking, getting more data back all the time to improve, as opposed to seeing data exercise at the front of a process for product and services, but as a continuous exercise, I suppose, is what you're saying.
And you should always be optimizing. You know, it's not that you've got to that end point, you know, because you may have delivered that product or service, but your customers are changing constantly, the market's changing constantly. So what works in 2021 may not necessarily work in 2022. So it's never ending.
Little and often, by the sounds of it, to keep iterating. Yeah, maybe. But again, how long's a piece of string? Paul, I just wondered, again, same question, but it's that kind of the importance, and I wonder if you have any, you know, any examples of when it works and when it doesn't work. And
yeah, so you're right. Top and foremost of every project we start is data quality and data availability, because it's quite difficult to do the stuff we do if you haven't got that stuff. But if you flip to the other end of the project, so in fact, something Ken's working on with us on right now, we run a costing solution for universities. And when you run it at full whack, it generates about 160 million records, financial transactions. We had to introduce the principle of materiality into those transactions, because we found that 30 million of them were a penny, which just wasn't material. Now, 30 million pennies is quite material, but each individual penny wasn't. So you get into that bit, which is looking at the value of studying that data or using it or rushing it out. The only other point I'd make is there's kind of two principles in life, and particularly, as I said, we spend a lot of time with universities. So if you do research, quite often what you will do is start off with a hypothesis, then you go find the data to meet the hypothesis. The other way, which is what Ken is talking about, is we start with the data and you extrapolate the hypothesis from the data that's available. So it really depends which of those you're doing.
yeah, and I imagine from your perspective, student, Paul, that can be very different because we have a lot of data, Paul, in your institutions, where that gives us maybe a signpost in the direction, perhaps, of a hypothesis. Whereas Judith, I imagine we're starting with hypothesis and testing them, and I'm being grossly sort of overstating perhaps where you both are, but I think it's a brilliant point, Paul, that it does depend on your starting point and how much data you have available to you as to whether or not you're taking, like say, a data-led approach or a data investigation or a data collection approach to understanding and testing and validating. Can I just, planning, I think we at Panintelligence are the first to admit that we've fallen into that trap of thinking we didn't need to do as a data business, perhaps not even doing enough of our own data gathering, right? Sometimes we're all in those positions where we're very good at doing it for others, but not always for ourselves. What do you think we've learned about the importance of this, and what would you say to others?
Yeah, that's called a Bossmans holiday, I think, isn't it? So we're always looking at everybody else's, and we finally get around to ours. I think there are different observation points, and you're right, Paul. Depends where you start, and also it is always a never-ending journey. Now, I'd say, the fact that only 5% of any projects actually end up being successful or end up being committed is probably not the problem. What we always need to do is to be able to start things, look at ideas very quickly. What's more important than whether the project necessarily fails or doesn't fail is being able to stop it at the relevant point if it's not going to be valid. And that's where, so we all work in software, that's where we'll collect different types of data as we go along. And I think part of the project planning should be how you collect those different data sets. So as we build a project internally, our first data collection probably looks at a very small subset of people. It's looking internally at what we think people want. And you then get to the point where you prototype something and you go to a different set of people and you ask people what they're going to collect. And the final piece is when you finish the project, the final data set you collect is who's prepared to pay for it, potentially. Now, not every project is like that, but you'll have different points and different data collections within there. And really, all you can do, the best you can ever plan to do, is to look at previous observations to find out whether you feel like you're on a good track or not track. And that previous observation point then becomes that context for you. So does this look good? Does this not look good? And because we all work in IT, so much changes. Every day we come into the workplace, somebody's got a new bit of technology, a new idea, a new something. So we have to be able to do these things very quickly to count them or discount them in. And I think anyone who works in IT knows that planning, and certainly timing, so planning project duration and project delivery, is very, very difficult, because we tend to be walking on new ground every time we do something. But there's always a lesson to be learned from the past, and it is that iterative cycle. We've got to just get better and better at this. And if you're starting out from scratch and you don't have that data set, that's where you've got to look and see where you can get the data from outside of the organisation, potentially, or doing simple things. And I suspect Judith and Paul, you work in the same way as we do. Let's pull some people together. So we'll grab a subset of customers or a subset of prospects, pull them onto a call and try some ideas out with them and see what goes on. And that's where the initial idea of Panintelligence came from, just trying it with people. So that kind of works, but making sure that we're constantly measuring things going, because I think it's what's most important is to know when to stop, when to challenge, and when to restart something is probably the best case. And sometimes projects will just go badly, and you just need to know at what point you need to stop, go back to the design board and rethink it. And it's not the fact it fails, it's the fact that you spend too long on a failed project is probably the worst thing that could possibly happen. And it's just collecting data continuously, and it's never ending. It'll never finish.
And I think there's a really good point there, Ken, about the sort of stage that a project or an organisation is at, and the amount of data that may potentially be available to it, as to how effective that kind of data exercise may or may not be. And I think if you're an enterprise organisation, you may have tons of data at your disposal that you can use to point you in the right direction. Whereas if you're a startup testing a hypothesis of a go-to-market product or service, there's an awful lot of kind of creation of data, because invariably it's not data that you have to your hand. So I suppose depending on where you are on the journey of your organisation or even your product itself, will determine how data can be used to inform, I imagine, and the type of data we may be collecting. So I think it's like you say, I think Judith right at the start said it depends, and it does depend on where that product, service, or the life cycle of that is. And but nevertheless, we're talking about it's a continuous process, whether it's a small amount of data just to test and validate an assumption at the starting point, or you're at an enterprise stage of major projects and iterating something where you're crunching through so much data you can't see the wood for the trees. In all of those cases, it's always iterative, which I think is what everyone's saying. Just to summarise it, I'm going to ask another question, if that's okay. I might start with Ken this time, because I feel like Paul and Judith, you've done your your bit of going first. So Ken's going to start this time. So data has been referred to as the new oil. I know that we've used this phrase quite a lot, and I say it has been. I think it's been referred to as the new oil for some time now. I think I've heard this phrase for about 10 years. Is it new? I think it's been the oil. I think we've been mining it, and the fields have been out there for some time. But what does this literally mean? You know, when people are using this phrase, it's been around a long time. What do people mean by it? What's that all about?
Well, as an avid driver of an electric car and trying not to use oil for anything, it's like with anything being the new oil. I think oil is the old everything anyway, and we shouldn't be burning oil. It should stay in the ground. But I won't go on that massive campaign right now. I think where this is important, and again, it comes down to we're going to make decisions on previous observation points. And actually, one of the realizations is we probably don't have very many observation points when we start something afresh, or as a small company or as a small entity, we probably don't have much of that observable historical data to base decisions on. Now, where data is the new oil, it applies particularly in our case to our customers, and they could be SaaS customers or they could be enterprise customers who collect data for multiple parties on their side. So we take Paul as an example. One of the universities there that's doing planning and making decisions has a very finite set of data. They have a finite set of students, and that's all they can collect. But actually, when we start to aggregate and pull that collection of data together, then it becomes much more valuable, because you get to be a small part of a greater whole, and that all adds to the context. So not only are we just looking at what's gone on in our own university or our own subset of data, but we can now start to look at what's happening with other entities. You know, are we? And it comes down to, if you give someone a number. So, you know, say for example, you tell me what's in my bank statement. I don't know whether that's good or bad until I start to have some context in that. And context could be me over time. You know, what do I normally have in my bank statement? Or actually, what it might be better with is me looking at the population in general and seeing whether I have more or less money than anyone else. So if I have a lot less money than most people in the population, it's time for me to put my ideas up and try and save a bit more cash or whatever it might be from that point of view. But that's really where as software vendors, we should start thinking about this from a monetization point of view, because it's the real value add that we can provide on the services that we already add. So we have to have the services which allow people to operationally run their business. We can now give them the context and some information to help them run better services and better businesses. But we can now take that whole distribution and give them the context of how well they are running their particular service or planning their particular project, or whatever it might be, by looking at the whole picture. And it is that huge benefit of being able to give someone almost a ready-defined data set, or see exactly where they sit within there. And that's where, you know, mining that data, digging up the oil that is the data, is the valuable resource that people are sitting on. And I think businesses are really starting to wake up to that. The likes of Google, Amazon, Apple have known this for a very, very long time. Tesco and their club card, they knew exactly why they were collecting data over large data sets, and they know how to get value from it. And we all need to start to think like that.
So I think there's a strong sort of argument here for there being a sort of evolution of the ability for us to start aggregating technology from multiple sources in a way that allows for that benchmarking. I think would be probably a way to describe that kind of an example where, you know, people can start to, if they only have a small set of data, compare themselves to a much larger cohort or get the benefit of a prediction from a much larger group to their own scenario, because the larger the data set, the more likely we are to make a hypothesis, or validate a hypothesis, or validate a prediction, because that data set is of a size that perhaps we're not able to gather ourselves. But that larger data set enables a much better quality of kind of comparative insight, or, you know, hypothesis validation. And really, for a long time, it's been so siloed as data, that data has been locked in, you know, technologies which have been not easy to bring together, because it's been, you know, that migration to the wonderful word cloud and SaaS that we know so many of our partners have either been on that journey or are there right now. That has been a huge enabler for kind of the bringing together of data sets quickly and allowing for that to be possible, so that we can kind of drive that value out of these much larger data sets, that kind of validation from a larger data set to justify a kind of decision or an action or that we're going to take, if that makes sense. I think that's what you're saying, really. But I do think there is, like most things, there is a kind of coming together of different technologies that allow for data to become the new oil, that makes it important. And I was just wondering, Paul, Judith, what you believe, beyond what Ken said, that is about, whether there's anything that is really making it happen now. We've talked about it for many years, but it does feel like there's a real change in an awakening of industry to being able to do this, or wanting to do this, or capability. I'm just wondering what you're seeing or hearing or noticing. Judith, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if, as you say, you know, data is the new oil, that's been something that's been referenced for a long time. And I just, you know, in a conversation this morning, someone referred to an organisation being data rich but insight poor. And so actually, you know, with the proliferation of data points and data sources, you know, the data itself is plentiful. The bit that certain organisations are struggling with, either whether, you know, this is a factor of time, of available resource, of budget, it is taking the data and making something meaningful from it. You know, so that transition from data to insight. So, you know, maybe insight is the new oil, because, you know, it's all well and good having all of those different sources, but what are you going to do? What are you going to do with it? You know, how do you action it? How do you make sense of it? And from an organizational point of view, data can exist in silos. And so how can you bring an organization together, you know, to a kind of central purpose, using the data and using that evidence to align everyone to, and this is what we're going to do as a result of it.
Yeah, and it's still back to basics. Ken always says for 20 years we've been still trying to solve the same problem in business intelligence, which is just enabling people to get access to what's happening now. You know, they're still struggling to get access to what happened yesterday, and having that kind of ability to have one view of multiple siloed sets of information still feels like first base. We're not off that first base for many people, and there's a real need for us to kind of work out and drive that, but enable people to kind of look into that challenge in a way that they feel is something that they can do easily. Because I think for many it still feels like a big task, a big thing to overcome. And I think it's a job that we keep trying to educate and inform that this is something that can be done easily and is within people's gifts. Like I say, could be time, Judith. Sometimes it's not knowing the art of the possible and the technology that is available to them to do this, but also that there's been such an acceleration, as Ken said, of new technologies that are coming together, whether it's the cloud sort of database technologies, tools that move data around, and technologies like ours that enable that simple kind of presentation and an analysis layer, that the convergence of those technologies is now making this an easier and easier thing for people to be able to do, to when perhaps in the past it's felt much harder. So yeah, just trying to solve that basic problem feels like what a lot of people say. And yeah, I love the insights is the new oil, because I do think we need to move on saying the data is. I think everyone sort of gets it now, like you said. Paul, I just wondered what your thoughts were on this as well.
Well, I'll probably pick up Ken's theme as somebody else who drives an electric car, in that it's the new oil. It probably is, because it's producing more carbon emissions than actually oil is these days with the number of data centers we're running. So there's the thought for you.
Yeah.
It's also similar to oil, and if you go back halfway through the lockdown, there was so much oil, nobody knew what to do with it. And I think we're heading towards that stage. The thing that makes it possible, and Sandra, you'll remember this, 1996, I think off the top of my head, it was $70,000 a terabyte for storage. By 2002, it was about $7,000 a terabyte. In my bag over there, I've got a terabyte memory stick that I think cost 20 quid. So the underpinning bit that makes it possible is that stuff's really cheap comparatively. So I think the ability to store it has helped. I think you're right. All the different companies you named, we're collecting, I don't know what the measure of storage is or data is as opposed to storage, but there's gallons of it around anywhere if we're using the oil analogy. I think our challenge is going to be making some sense of it. So we're collecting it. I think we're probably collecting more than we ever needed. Some we'll never need and never look at until we do. But the problem is figuring out what we want to do with it, and it's kind of Ken's point. So we can go and throw all sorts of tools at it to find interesting pathways, like Tesco's did and everybody else did. I think it was nappies and beer, if I remember rightly, wasn't it, Ken? On a Friday night shopping. It was most men went in on a Friday night and bought nappies and beer, so they put the beer close to the nappies or the nappies close to the beer, and the sales of both went up because that happened to be the identification of that particular group. Is that the one you were thinking of?
There's a good one I heard, which was whenever they had a new game release, they knew that the kids would go in at 2 in the morning to buy the new game, and then they'd sell them a whole load of Coca-Cola because they needed to stay awake playing the game all night. So that was something that was, they'd make sure that when there was a new game released, they'd have to walk past the Coca-Cola stand and buy 6 litres of Coke.
Does that come under the good use or bad use of that? I'm not quite sure. But yes, using those huge amounts of data, it's the new oil because it enables us to do things differently and think of things differently than we used to. So I think I quite like Judith's thing about the insights. But every decision certainly we make in Simitive and we talk about stuff is always backed up by some form of data, hopefully information if we've ascribed a little more value to it, that enables us to at least feel as though we're making better decisions than we did without the data.
So if it's got cheaper to store it, in theory it's got it easier to consolidate and bring it all together so that we've got much larger sets of data for more confident analysis around the things that we are interested in understanding, observing, testing, validating. Why do we still have a challenge? And is it about technology? It doesn't seem to be about a lack of data. It doesn't seem to be a lack of, is it about people's understanding of data analysis and how to use data to drive decisions? I just wondered if you thought there was something else beyond, if we've got a lot of the mix of the things now that are there for everybody to use, what's holding things back at the moment? And with Ken, if you wanted to just start.
Well, I'll be really cheeky. I think sometimes it does come to prioritization. So we still see a lot of projects where business intelligence, data transformation, turning these things into insights is bolted onto the back of a project. And I'm not just saying that because I'm in that industry and I think it should be the forefront of everything that's in there, but it's not often seen as a critical need within these systems, and it's not built in from the beginning. I don't think it's taught very well in universities. So people attending and doing technology degrees, I don't think it's taught particularly well. Conversely, in the world of business and the world of MBAs, the world of an MBA study is driven a lot around how people derive information and knowledge from data, but very rarely are the two things brought together very, very satisfactorily. I'll say the word, but not done very well. And I think, you know, at its heart, really, there's still a bit of a problem. It's why I quite like the fact that people are using businesses being data driven nowadays. I think that's a really, really useful way for things to start to think about how and why they do. I think, Paul, a lot of data has been used fairly nefariously and will continue to be used fairly nefariously. I'm not in any way condoning selling Coca-Cola to kids who buy games, but I think, you know, that has tended to be how a lot of this data is used. You know, marketeers are very, very good. There are very positive sides to the way marketing companies work as well, and use data to target us more efficiently, give us messages that are more useful to us. So it's not all negative on that side of things at all. But I do think a lot of it comes down to prioritization and people really understanding the value that can be driven out of the data. And where we talk about return on investment, I think businesses, directors, boards should really drive their companies from an ROI point of view to understand the cost of collection, the cost of data retention, and the actual value that it drives. And that's something that everyone needs to become a lot more skeptical about and drive a little bit more accurately from that point of view. And I think, you know, Judith's point at the beginning really about you know, let's become more evidence-based and a little bit less opinion-based. I think a lot of people, it's very easy just to walk around with a lot of opinions, and it's actually often quite hard to test that and get the evidence-based that up. And I'll be fair, a lot of people like an easy path through life, don't they? I think we all try and work as little as we possibly can sometimes. So sometimes, you know, we just have to do the hard miles, make sure it is evidence-based, collect the data, but get the value out of it. So I think it's really driving people's desire to use the data is probably the biggest thing. That hasn't changed, I don't think, massively.
And I love the sort of 3 points you raised as to what's stopping us if all of the other pieces of the puzzle are there. I think the education and educating people on how to do this and making it something that they're confident in and therefore would choose to sort of work with as business people or people in industry, whatever that might be, as opposed to it being a sort of separate discipline inside an organisation that everybody sees themselves as a data analyst actually in some form and have confidence in that. I think that's a really valuable point. It'd be great to see more of that in the education system from early years, frankly, would be brilliant. Prioritisation, absolutely, we see it all the time in the projects that we work on as an afterthought as opposed to a first thought. And I just want to an observation from our experiences, and what we often hear is we can go into projects and the first thing we hear is, we're not sure our data is good enough to do something with. And our response to that is always, actually, you need to use some tools or some technology, or you need to use something to understand what is good in your data and what's not, and use that then to help people understand why data is important to the organisation, see what's good and what's not, and let them drive their behaviours to improve that quality. So by making data visible, like what's behind Ken's shoulders, I'm literally waiting. Can you see there's a green box on its own on the right hand corner? When a second green box appears, I know my sales team have signed another contract today. So that, you know, I know when that pings green that I'll be silently celebrating inside. But when you make data visible and everybody sort of sees the importance of, that's my salesperson going into the CRM system and updating a status on a record, because that's on the screens all over our offices and behind Ken's head, guess what? It's the first thing they think to do when that customer has agreed to work with us, because they know everyone will know about it instantly. So sometimes making things visible is what drives the change in behaviour towards data, and then you start to create a data organisation and a data culture. So prioritisation is often because you don't have a data-driven organisation that understands the value of data, and actually data quality only improves when you start to create that data-driven organisation and culture by making data visible. It's a chicken and egg, but I really believe that that's something that we need to be helping organisations to understand. Don't wait for your data to be perfect, because it never will be. Drive the organisation to enable you to improve the quality of your data by making it visible. And the last thing you said, Ken, which I thought was really good, was perhaps where, as a data industry, as all people interested in helping others drive value from data, that the usage of data by others, perhaps nefarious, I can't even say that word, right? So, but you know, the Coke and the video games analogy I thought was brilliant, Paul. But you know, there has been a lot of really poor examples, often highly publicised. You know, we all know Cambridge Analytica and you know, the Trump campaign and the use of Facebook, and I'm sure we can all reference really bad uses of data, and I can also reference real examples of data leakages where you know there's been you know, data records that have unfortunately escaped organisations. And unfortunately, I can probably name more of those, and most people can probably name more data horror stories, unfortunately, than people are talking really positively about the real change that data's driving, you know. And I'd love to see more of that. I think as an industry and as a community, we have a big responsibility to make sure those stories are heard a lot more loudly so that we can change that dialogue and maybe then change people's attitude towards data from being something for maybe not so good use for something for really good use. So I think we've got to change people's attitudes towards what they think data can be used for and understand that it's a good thing, and therefore they're more likely to engage in that conversation. So I just wanted to reframe it because I thought Ken came up with some brilliant points there that felt really valuable. I suppose both Judith, yourself and Paul, just thinking about, you know, what's stopping, you know, we've talked about some different, is there anything else that, when you were listening to Ken, sort of came to mind? Paul, if you want to start.
I'd say the honest and biggest thing that prevents it is people not wanting to change. Now, have all the data in the world, all the best evidence in the world, but if they really don't want to change, you have to think as I so actually a huge part of our business is change management and business change. We can produce the data easily to show what should be done, what's not working, what is working, how much better it would work. But if, silly example, I'll stick to universities, if I've been delivering the same course in ancient Greek, probably since the ancient Greek times, my desire to change what I'm doing and, I don't know, move online or whatever might be somewhat less than someone who's brand new to it and full of the vim and vigor of a new academic. So people not wanting to change is the biggest challenge.
And interesting, we've been through one of the biggest change events I think many of us may ever live through, and for many generations, other than perhaps you know, the European wars for those that knew it, but globally probably one of the biggest change events that we've all. Has that changed people's attitudes towards change? Do we feel we have a more of a change appetite in society because we've all had to change our habits and the way we work and lots of other things? Do you think that may have helped, or do you think we're just all going to go back to our old kind of stuck in our ways habits?
Go on, Judith.
Get my crystal ball out. I think there will be some attitudes, behaviours that stick. It's really, really difficult to know what. I think the force of the rate of change, as you say, is just unprecedented. The speed with which we needed to change the way that we worked. You know, I know of contact centres, for example, in the insurance industry, where they had very siloed teams, and they had one team that was responsible for sales and generating quotes, and another team that was responsible for claims management. And so you think about that in the context of car, you know, people aren't driving, people aren't necessarily buying a new car. So all of those drivers, all of those things that would prompt calls into a contact centre, you know, overnight they had these teams siloed, and you know, they couldn't move them from one to another. So, you know, almost it took a really dramatic event to force a re-evaluation of how that business was organised, you know, what those teams looked like, how they were composed, and the flexibility to kind of work across different areas of the business. So we've kind of gone to an extreme of this model doesn't work, we need to examine how it can work better. And so, you know, companies have been forced to do that. So to your point, Paul, they may not have wanted to do it. It was a forced change. But I think, you know, and I hope that from that, you know, good will come out. You know, people will see that actually they're in a better place now. Quite what sticks and what doesn't, we don't yet know. And we're beginning to do studies with some of our clients on, you know, essentially this is where we were, this is where we are now. Everyone recognises that behaviours have changed quite fundamentally, but what does that mean for the here and now? And what can we assume is going to be the new normal, to use that horrible phrase? what is just a behaviour that was kind of a feature of the past 12 months, but people are really reluctant to drop that and move back to how they were. So I think just to kind of go back to the question and, what's stopping us, I wonder if within organisations, we've almost got an element of data and kind of efficient, strong use of data, and converting that data into insight is the responsibility of a number of people. It's then no one's responsibility. So if you've not got that really strong advocate, that person who is really passionate about within an organisation, be it a chief data officer or whomever that is. Lots of people have access to data, use data, but it's not being brought together a greater good. It just sits in those silos. So I think organisational structure is really key.
Yeah, that's a champion, really, that leader on an owner of data. It's interesting, a really good data set. If you've ever seen sort of the LinkedIn reports that show the kind of rise of job titles and the decline of job titles as almost like lead indicators of what's going on, and the chief data officer just sort of appeared out of nowhere, and suddenly there was just, every large corporate had one overnight. So it's been interesting to see that that's now sort of making its way through most organisations. Might not be a CDO, but you do tend to have somebody that now has data in their title in organisations now, and we never saw that before. It was, at best we might have a business intelligence or a MI management information, and often technical, and often sat within a team that was essentially a data wrangling, if I was being honest. Whereas now we have people that are strategic and corporate and are looking at the objectives of the organisation and what data is needed to be able to understand, prioritise and make decisions around. So I think it's a really, really good point, Judith. And you know what, Paul, I was being a bit facetious and cheeky asking the change question. I actually believe that, we're all creatures of habit, and we've had forced change, to Judith's point, which we've not really had a choice but had to lean into. But do we continue to put ourselves in that position as humans? I think what we do is default back to a place of comfort invariably when we're not forced to change. So I imagine some habits are broken, but I imagine there'll be some new habits that just simply stick. So I'm hoping some of the good changes do stick. Personally, I think the quality of work-life balance for both our team and what I've seen, that kind of reduced travel, good for the environment, but I think for good for family and good for home. I would love to see that that's a permanent change that I think we're all benefiting from, personally speaking. So I've got another question, and it's probably segues into the change conversation we've just had, really. And I'm not sure if this also has a bit of an ethics angle to it, so let's just see where the conversation goes. We've got a question here, which is, are you sure people are using the data that they're using it in the way it was intended? So sometimes we collect data for a particular purpose, but actually how it's then used, and whether we're talking about good or bad, or whether or not people are innovating, seeing data to be used for different purposes that we haven't seen. I just wondered what your experiences were of that kind of observing how data is used differently from the purpose in which it was originally created, curated, or intended. So yeah, I don't know if you'd like to start on that. I know Judith used to finish off, but maybe if we can come back to you, because obviously you're doing an awful lot of new data collection for organisations, and I just wonder if you sort of see at the outside of that, it providing sort of different types of use cases that they go on to use it for.
Kind of, yes, it's very, we're very protective of the data that we personally are gathering. A lot of it involves recruiting individual participants, and we're very candid about what the data will be used for, how far it will be kind of transported and circulated within organisations. So we are very protective of that. Interestingly, the World Federation of Advertisers has just published the first guide for brands on data ethics, and that, back to the point about Coke and all the rest of it, essentially how brands are using the data that they collect is something that has been completely unregulated. It's an implied trust in the relationship between a brand and a consumer. But I think as consumers, we are questioning more and more how that data is being collected, why is it being collected, and for what purpose. So the fact that that an organisation like that is kind of taking a stance and holding brands to account and giving that guidance as to how they should be managing that data, I think signals an issue. A kind of unrelated point, but I think still very relevant. When we gather information about audience profiling, so for example, if we're capturing someone's ethnicity, you always have the option prefer not to say, and you'll be astonished. We know from some organisations that we've worked with, the number of people who choose to select that rather than give their ethnicity, their gender preference, whatever that may be. And that, I think, signals a suspicion as to, well, what are you going to do with that data? So if I were to declare myself, with a particular gender or a particular racial background, what are you going to do with it? So I think suspicion of how data is used and the ethics that sit around it is just ever increasing.
It's a complex area, isn't it? Because I think it's everybody in the industry, the data industry, is looking at where the sort of guidance is coming from and the regulation, and I think is continuously evolving. And even as we've kind of moved from Europe and post-Brexit, there's still conversations around data movement and that are not have not been completed conversations and regulations. So I think it feels like it constantly changes, which is good. That there's a lot of continued sort of conversation around this, because I think it's a complex area, and I think we're only going to see a lot more regulation and a lot more frameworks coming out by sector for how data is kind of used and for what purpose, which I think will help everybody to get more confident in using data for different contexts. Because I think part of what maybe holds us back, which was in the last conversation, is the fact that people are nervous to do things because they're not really sure what they're allowed to do and what is within the boundaries of data, perhaps ethics, or just generally kind of, am I allowed to use that data or not? And I think there's part of that people need some regulation or some guidance so that they can feel that they're not stepping over some invisible lines that they don't know they're crossing, perhaps. And I think in some ways that might be key to helping people to be more confident in like you say, using it for wider use. Ken, I just wondered, what do you think on this? We've talked about this a lot before. It's an interesting, takes us down lots of rabbit holes, doesn't it? Our last webinar we had a detailed conversation around this.
Yeah, so very long time ago, I studied psychology at university. I'm an armchair psychologist now as opposed to anything else, but I do know how easy it is to manipulate people. And I think people are very surprised often when they find out how easy it is that they can be manipulated. And one of the greatest mechanisms that businesses have to manipulate people, again, for the good or the bad, is data. And I think what's really, really changed in my lifetime is the collection of the data by unregulated parties. So certainly in the West, it is big business. So when we say this like these are evil businesses, Google, Amazon, Apple, it's not that they're evil businesses, but they are allowed to do things in an unregulated fashion. And GDPR went some way to address that, but I think we're just at the beginning of understanding how we should control data. And I think there's a bit of a personal responsibility and a personal education required around this. Just not quite for fun, but I did a series of lectures a couple of years ago where I was talking to some old Rotarian type people. They were raising a bit of money for charity, and I was telling them exactly what happens when they use a smartphone, what data is collected, how that could potentially be used, and how that could be potentially used in the future. And even going through some of the simple activities like we've all seen the Google pop-up that comes and every time they change their data collection policies, and the fact that we all just scroll down that and tick the accept because we're in a rush to find cinema times or whatever it is when it pops up. Google know that as well, so they know how long you read that screen for and whether you actually just tick it. And when you actually dig into some of the details of what you're granting that business and other businesses like them the ability to do with your data. It is for a very, very wide use case. So where people say, is the data being collected and used only for the purpose that it's being collected in? When you introduce legislation to say that you must get the acceptance, then these big businesses have very, very clever lawyers who will change the policies to make sure that they still don't fall foul of the regulation and they collect the data for what you need. And I think there's a very, very big discussion to be had around how this goes and how much further we let this go, because we agree to use a lot of free services, a lot of amazing services, but the cost to that is the data that we share and the ability that we allow people to manipulate us, certainly from a marketing, but for other purposes as well. And we need to be really aware of when and how we're giving data and how we're sharing it with these businesses. And I think I was quite intrigued this week. The Super League, I think you mentioned it right at the beginning, Sandra. So we were all up in arms that there was going to be a Super League formed, and that was big business running away. And it looks like with the power of fans, that may well be stopped, or certainly turned into something maybe a bit better. And it's interesting to see how much passion the country had very, very quickly for that, whereas there's much worse things going on, arguably, day in, day out, that we're not so aware of, or we're not so passionate about, that we need to start to get a bit more passionate about and understand how these things are used. I think we all need to have a little bit of that old university mentality had when we went on marches, not wanting to carry ID cards, and listen to that a little bit more and just understand how and what data is collected and used for. Those of us who work in the data industry have an absolute responsibility as well, though, to be as ethical as we possibly can. But ethics is a difficult subject when it comes to humans, because what's good for one person can be terrible for another person. We have to understand it's not just about data. Humans have very poor ethics. Humans have an awful lot of bias, and we just have to make sure that we try and tackle it. But we've got a long, long way to go. We've got a long way to go as a society to cope with the change and the amount of data that now, and the amount of influence people can have on us. We've got a long way to go to put some of that right.
Yeah, and I think I watched a program with my children. Actually, it was a Netflix program, which was all about social media apps and the data they collect on you, and therefore how they influence you. I can't remember the name of it, but it was incredible to watch it with my children and realize they just had absolutely no understanding that these tools that they trusted, these applications that they were using all the time, were manipulating them. Very simply put, that they were being fed based on an algorithm. And then we had this really kind of good conversation together about why that was a bad thing, and kind of getting siloed into something where you're only being told the stuff that they think you want to hear. So you're narrowing your world and narrowing your perspective, and therefore easier to influence as a result of that. But it was interesting that was a conversation I had with my children that were totally unaware. And I go back to the point you made before about education. I think there is ethics in education. I think we need to, a bit like how do you change behaviours around data quality, make it visible, and then everyone understands what's good and what's not, so they do something about it. I do think there's something here around sort of ethics and education. The more we educate everyone, the more people know that there's a Super League starting. The more everybody then kind of goes, oh, actually, this isn't a good thing, and then drives the need for policy and need for regulation, because the community kind of goes, this isn't good and I'm not happy about it. So I think whilst we've got a lot of people sort of ignorant to that manipulation and what's happening, I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg, but definitely an area that we should all be influencing and involved in. I totally agree. It's and be aware as well, be able to talk about, and we sit on to the Tech UK's Data Analytics Council that sort of advises policy, that advises government, and I think there's lots of those sort of organisations that we can all participate in. If anybody's listening on this call and wants to know how they can get involved in those kind of things, drop me a line and I'll point you in the direction of some good organisations where you can participate in that conversation. Paul, what's your experience? The universities are long-standing institutions that probably have quite a lot of governance around data, I imagine, and probably have a lot of experts in their institutions that talk about data ethics, I imagine too. I just wonder what your experience was on this subject at the university.
Oh, some of it goes back to one of Ken's earlier points. So yes, there is data collected on students, on staff, and everything else. But there is an enormous amount of data collected for research purposes.
Yeah.
And some of that research is into stuff most of us wouldn't even want to know about because it's not very nice. But actually, they still need to do the research. So you've got this, I don't know, it's almost an explosion of data that goes out. But I probably would go back to the original point, which is, I think there are degrees of, so again, to pick up one of Ken's phrases, there's absolute out and out nefarious intent in collecting data in the first place. I think there is pseudo-nefarious covert collection of data, which is what you're referring to. But there's a really interesting thing that comes out, which isn't either of those, where we've collected data and it shows us something we didn't expect it to. And it's not we started off with the intent to do that or anybody's doing anything wrong. It's just when you analyze it, it's just completely out of the blue. Now that can often be misconstrued. It's not, it's just the data showed you something you weren't expecting. And that covers all sorts of areas, whether it be in the police, where there's some interesting stats around that, or in what the pseudo-nefarious companies that may have been named by Ken, although there are other companies that exist, of course.
I think there's a really interesting point there, Paul, about finding some useful use, not a great combination of words, but some use for data that hadn't been intended to be collected for that purpose. But also, it's not just sometimes we're collecting data for a purpose and actually somebody else sees value in that data because they've got a different data set that when you bring it together actually gives a completely different kind of pattern or shows or demonstrates something. You know, we talked weather data before, Ken mentioned bringing that into retail. You know, I think sometimes we don't collect weather data because we want to improve footfall in stores, but it might if we bring those two data sets together. We're collecting weather data to tell people whether it's sunny or not. But actually, the use of that data to enable planning of staffing levels in retailers could be really useful. So I just wondered if there were some good examples of that, talking maybe going from the sort of maybe nefarious side of data and usage, and maybe moving over to the kind of really surprisingly good kind of opportunities that can come out of identifying a data set that perhaps you weren't aware was there. We use something called Kaggle, Ken, and there's other sources, you might want to mention a few actually on this, where open data sets that actually you can use to bring alongside your own data, which actually can drive a huge amount more value. And I know it might be worth mentioning a university example with libraries, I think it was, but just how combining data together that wasn't intended for use. Have you got any examples of that? I don't know, Ken, I know you have lots of examples, but it might give Judith and Paul a bit of time to think, because I've asked them a question that we haven't tabled.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about correlation versus causation and things like that. But you know, some of the things you can absolutely see in data sets can be quite surprising, and they tend to be the things that drive the actions out of the data. It is that point where someone goes very quiet because you've just told them something they didn't know before in their data. And someone said this to me years and years ago, which is, that's great, Ken, but tell me what I don't know about my data. And I thought it was the most impossible question that someone gave me ever. But really what they meant is, you know, you've told me nothing new. You've made it look different, but tell me what I didn't know before. And the only way you do that is through data exploration. And that's where tools really become important. We said that you tend to find the most frightening or the most important bits of information when you're not actually looking for it. And it can be, as you're putting that data together, suddenly there's something which doesn't look quite right. And you need the person there who understands what that context would be. So we had a really, really good example. It was with a council, and we were doing a predictive model to look at how long engineers were spending on a job. And as soon as we put the data through there, we found instantly that, first of all, the simple fact that engineers were spending on average much longer than they thought on a job was really significant. But we could see instantly there was a split based on completion date. Now, I don't know whether that background noise is coming from me. I hope not. whether the completion date was completed or not was really significant. Now suddenly we thought, well, we've got a data set here which is looking at completed jobs, so we've got things which aren't completed. That must be in. But the people we were doing the data set for had gone silent and were starting to whisper to each other. So sometimes you just sit back and you listen to what people are saying because they're about to give you the gems in the data set. And actually what they were saying was they had a sister company who they just bought some data in from, and they knew that there was a problem with that data set where the completion date wasn't populated. So actually the completion date not being there was just a proxy for whether it was their own data or the data for the business that was in there. And the reason they were getting quite animated and talking to each other was they could actually see that it was non-funded jobs that were taking all of the time. So it was the painting and decorating. I think this was, council jobs that they were going out and doing. So not only was the average job duration a lot more significant than they thought it was, it was actually instantly on all of the jobs that they shouldn't have been spending time on, that all of that was happening on. And it was in a data set that they'd given us in a spreadsheet. We just evolved it and turned it through a really simple process to visualize it. And instantly we'd done, if I rolled back all those 20 years to what a guy, and I still remember he was called Des, and it was 2 o'clock in the morning when he was telling me this as well, which is showing me what we didn't know about the data. And that's exactly what we'd done. And it was because they were involved in the process of evaluating the data that they could see and add the specific context and the understanding to that data to allow us to really understand that there was a problem there to be addressed. And over and over and over throughout my career, those have been the biggest things that we've noticed, where someone's just sort of had an oh my God moment, or I wonder if this is this. And for all the ones we've investigated where it's not probably something, the times that we found, really significant problems. And that is where tools become really, really important. And I have a real problem with the word data scientist, because I think that wraps up and makes this thing seem like it's for these people over here. You've got to have a lab coat on and you've got to be a genius to do it. Actually, it's the domain experts who can give you that understanding instantly and go, that is a problem, or that isn't a problem, or oh my God, that's such a problem. We need to stop everything that we're doing and address this right now. And that really is where it becomes so incredibly important that the right people are involved and are able to not necessarily dabble. And there's a couple of questions I've seen come in here, and is it always right about when people see data? I think some of that is the fear that we use ourselves to stop people looking at things. It should always challenge, raise questions, get people to ask questions for sure. But we mustn't be fearful about people having access to the data sets that they should have access to. They should have access to those, and we should share data. That's one of the principles that we believe in massively, is the fact that actually, with permission and with the right data that can be shared, if we share it, then we get much greater insights out of it much more quickly. And I've forgotten even what the question was there, Sandra. I just started rambling.
So we sort of went into a sort of correlation causation conversation, which is great, because I think part of what data enables us to do is identify a pattern or a cause quickly by using a kind of more, I'd say, a machine learning approach, which is a fancy way of basically looking for sort of we all hopefully did a little bit of probability at school and understand the kind of principles around probability scoring, the likelihood of something based on a bigger cohort of data. So if you're one of these and there's lots of them that created an outcome, then there's a high probability. If there's very few of them that created an outcome, then there's a low probability, I suppose, in simplest terms, that's sort of looking for those patterns quickly. And I suppose the question I had for you is, sometimes it's correlation can come from data sets that are not necessarily ones that you have, and they can be other data sets that can give you, like I suppose, weather and footfall, or it might be students attending the library and having a library card, and whether or not they do or don't attend, I suppose. And I think there's lots of examples. I think there's a famous one which is about sharks and ice cream. I think shark attacks and ice cream, which is ice cream van sales and predicting the likelihood of. but that sort of, where would people go to look for sort of data sets perhaps they don't have, where they can look for those sort of patterns of correlation? They've got a gut feeling that there's a link between weather data and football. I think often people have a sense that maybe there's a pattern there. How do we look for that? How do we do that? Where are those open data sets?
Got a really good one, which was sport correlation, and it was looking at season ticket renewals. And this was some data in the US, and they found that the number of hot dogs that people bought towards the end of the season was very, very significant in terms of whether they would renew their season ticket. Now, actually, what they were looking was fan engagement, because the more engaged the fan, the better time they were having, and the more likely they were to eat a hot dog, because miserable people don't eat hot dogs, I guess is the way it goes. But actually, there was then a very, very significant correlation between people eating hot dogs at the end of the season and season ticket renewal. So if hot dog sales were down, they'd have to make all sorts of offers and really engage with the fans in different ways to make sure that they retain that season ticket renewal going into the next season. Whereas if hot dogs were up, then it was really, really engaged, and actually there was a higher degree of correlation between hot dog sales and actual team performance, because not necessarily how badly or well the team's going, it's how much the fans are enjoying the season, and that can be all sorts of other environmental factors. But if you can find something which is significant and is a strong signifier, then you can actually use that to your advantage. Yeah, there's a really, really good example of where these things. We had another one in education, which was around propensity to go to the library in the first 6 weeks of sixth form college attendance showed student engagement very, very significantly. And we found subsets in some of that sixth form data around journey to college and things like that as well. So looking at people's travel routes, attendance to clubs within the sixth form, all of these sorts of things, can help look at student, fan, or generally how customers engage with you, and that can be very, very important.
Thanks, Ken. I know there's things like Kaggle and open data sets, and I think Paul sort of HESA is a data set that is in sort of higher education, which I know is open and larger sort of data set. I wondered if you had experiences of kind of third-party data helping to kind of inform, I mean, maybe not correlation for prediction, but I just wondered if you had any experience of that, really.
We use some of it. So we use some of the sector data sets, and we do benchmarking for universities, both within sector, without sector, national, international, and right down to subject area on all sorts of things, which in itself is quite interesting. But having a standardized data set from either Office of Students or HESA is just a useful addition to that, especially as in theory it's got a lot longer years. Although you'll also, if you read any of the wonderfully exciting HE press, you'll find so many questions over whether the outputs and the research excellence framework or the teaching excellence are actually meaningful. In fact, they're going through a whole discussion at the moment at government level as to what should they be measuring, which kind of goes to the input end of Ken's discussion, which is great. We can collect lots of data on all sorts of things, whether people are from a particular background or gender or race or creed or color or city or subject they did or anything else. They're having a great amount of difficulty figuring out what leads to those wonderful outcomes that everybody tries to achieve. So simple things. If you go and do maths and physics, your employability prospects are quite high. If you go into acting, they're surprisingly or perhaps not low. Great, but they haven't got to the why bit, so they're not extrapolating that out into something. They're still busy arguing about the validity of the data they're actually collecting in the first place. What I would say, just again, picking up your earlier thing, thankfully I have zero interest in football whatsoever, never have had, never will do. And I can honestly say I am pleasantly surprised at the ability of the news feeds to realize that and not send me anything about whatever happened this week. So I've got no idea what you're talking about, but it sounded great.
And the nefarious use of your algorithms have served you well then.
Yeah, didn't mind that one.
That's no bad thing. That's good to hear, because mine's absolutely full of it. But no surprise, as a football coach, that would happen, right? so yeah. Yeah, and I suppose there is a really valid point. If you've got tons and tons of data, going out and trying to find more data for the purposes of correlation is probably not a priority when you're still working out whether what you've got is useful and that you can drive meaningful results from that. Is probably where I think, Paul, you're just sort of saying things are for your industry.
Well, and also, I mean, let's be honest, we've probably all been deluged with more analysis of data, correlated and extrapolated theories around it with COVID in just about every news item, newsreel, news channel, paper, online paper, and everything else. Most of them coming up with completely different conclusions, which was fascinating. Trying to correlate what was going to kill you and what wasn't, and what did make you die and what didn't make you die, and whether it was old, young, or I mean, it's just been amazing. And the fact it's been changed and changed and changed whilst trying to pull in all sorts of data sets from everywhere. I think it was better to write a book on it, Ken.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's done the data industry any good. At first, when I saw all the charts and everything, I was like, great, this is going to really educate people into understanding sort of the value of real-time kind of insight and data. But I think you're right, Paul. I think it's probably also created as much confusion as it's created clarity and understanding, and therefore, you know, probably not done it any good. But, you know, I'm certainly, you know, my kids know where to look for the COVID charts and they know how to read them. So if nothing else, maybe it's educated a younger generation on the value of knowing what's going on today, albeit in a quite macabre, I suppose, and not so pleasant circumstances. Judith, we've just had a circular conversation around correlation, causation, different data sets for that. I just wondered if you had some examples or thoughts.
I guess where we come in is that augmenting existing data and trying to make sense of that. So, you know, kind of back to what we said at the top, you know, the problem statements that our clients bring to us are because they've spotted a trend, and it could be a drop in a conversion rate. It could be friction at a particular point of the user journey. It could be increased number of calls into a contact center. So they have some clues, but, you know, they know there's a problem, and they may have some clues as to why that is. And where we come in is really to kind of have that first person discussion, those in-depth interviews, and find out, you know, what that actually means and why that's a cause of friction, you know, why that's a challenge. Is it miscomprehension? Is it, you know, it could be one of many things, but that's where we kind of augment that existing data. It's to give that context and the hows and whys of what's being spotted from data.
Is that sorry, Judith, I'm just, as you're talking, I'm sort of seeing that as sort of almost a first step to investigating a direction of travel. So you're sort of asking the why questions of the people that are in the experience of whatever that product service is they're trying to kind of explore or understand or change. That sort of approach helps to sort of lead to, actually a lot of people have said this, therefore we probably need to go and find some more information in this area that might help us to get a larger, you know, a larger cohort perspective. Is that the way it works? That you sort of, it's almost a bit like investigating, looking for clues, and then going and find the data to validate that.
And you know, particularly when it comes to UX research, there's a very natural link from UX research into conversion rate optimization. So, you know, we may surface you know, the evidence and the hows and the whys, but actually, you know, it doesn't give that immediate answer. It doesn't say this is the right thing to do. But what that might do is give, you know, 2, 3, 4 suggestions as to how something within a particular website experience, for example, could be changed. And then that feeds CRO, that, you know, gives the kind of multivariate testing options. And then, you know, you've got the evidence, you kind of put that out, you test which of those options is the more successful, and you build from there. So it is, you know, kind of that constant understanding what the problem is, giving the context, and giving some clues as to, you know, the further evidence or the further data that could be gathered to determine what the right solution is, and so it continues. So UX and CRO in this instance, you know, they're great bedfellows because you're providing that insight and you're giving the clues, and then the CRO teams can then, you know, put that into execution and test, and so it moves forward.
And it almost sounds a bit like back to Paul's point, you know, you can be collecting huge amounts of data, but whether you're collecting the right stuff and working out what the right stuff is sometimes requires a little bit back to basics investigation and asking people at the coalface what it is that they're experiencing that may be the clues to perhaps the data we need in order to find those correlations, find those those data points that are actually going to drive more value. And I think sometimes we assume that we have what we need, and yes, okay, we've got a lot of it. I think, Paul, you said earlier, you know, all this data, we may never look at it. And sometimes there's a whole load of stuff we should have that we simply don't have. We just don't know it's what we need. And it's a bit of a, how do we work that out? But I think your example, Judith, of that kind of, sometimes it's really going back and having the conversation, right, with adverts. In your case, maybe Paul went up with the student or the tutor, right? And Judith, you know, those customers that are having that experience on a website as to the clues to perhaps what we need to know from their experience to be able to make that better for them, or gather that. I'm conscious that we're sort of getting to a point where, you know, there's a couple of questions that have come in, and I think there's a couple that I'd like to sort of wrap up with, if that makes sense, because, you know, it's a long time to have a conversation like that. So I really appreciate that the conversation's flowed. So thank you so much. What do you think will make data more useful? And we've talked around this quite a bit, but is there anything that anything we haven't talked about today that you think would really, really help us to make data more useful? And if we've covered it, say so. Who'd like to start?
I'd just throw in there, I think humanizing the data. You know, I think that visualizing data is really, really important. And I love the dashboard that you've got behind you, Ken, and I love the simplicity of that. I think humanizing data and relating that back to how that affects on an individual level, you know, what someone's experience is like, and, you know, essentially how that all builds together, it is really, really important. And our customers see their customers struggling with something, taking great delight in something, you know, that creates a force for change. So I think the human impact and the humanization of it is really, really key. Data can be, forgive me, I'm speaking with data specialists, data can be dry. So it's ultimately how you can bring it to life, and generally that's by, you know, giving it that human characteristic and talking about impact.
Obviously, I completely agree, Judith. I couldn't disagree. Ken, you were going to say something.
It was very similar, absolutely. You know, we're producing this. You've got to keep remembering why we're producing this, and I think that's really something that gets lost in a lot of what we do. We forget the intent and the purpose for doing any of this, and it's getting people to work more effectively. Most people that I've ever come across really want to do a good job. They really want to be focused, and everyone is so incredibly busy and has an overload of information. So you asked at the top, what is data? And we're surrounded with data. It's not just the stuff that sits in the database. It's the emails. It's the LinkedIn. It's the stuff that we drown in every day. So to make sure that through all of that noise, you actually get through the right messages, you've got to do this very strategically and very purposefully, and you've got to keep reminding people. And I think the best ways with any kind of human is we're storytellers, and we should tell stories with data. That's how people understand, that's how they learn, that's how they reiterate. The dashboard that sits behind me is very purposefully behind me, because I want to remind people that I use this data. And whenever they ask, I can tell them how I use that data and how it's effective to me. And I think that's when I really engage with people, is by saying, the reason this matters to me is it's told me this, and I've been able to do this, and it's had this benefit. And it's all that sort of so what side of things. My wife's really good at this. Every time I tell her anything, she'll just go, so what? And unless I can explain to her what value it's given me or the people around me, and what was the purpose of doing it. And you've got to tunnel through all of this noise. You've got to give people simple things, but you've got to get those people who are proponents and become those storytellers about why something's good for them. And you've got to put them out and let them tell other people about it. We've been in business intelligence for so long. You know, I can tell a lot of people about business intelligence and why it's important. But when someone who sits next to them and they say, well, this saves me 2 hours a day, or I'm now able to do this, that's when the person in that business goes, oh, well, I'm going to use that as well. It's not when we give them a whole load of marketing spiel and stuff. Sorry, marketing too much here. I didn't mean that at all, but it's not that sort of spiel which touches in with people. It's when they tell them why and how it's made their life better. And it's the same with everything.
And I'm mindful that I think we've got had a lot of conversation about different types of data, the use of data, the challenges. But it does come down to, at the end of the day, if somebody can't interpret it from a very simple image or understand it easily, then all of that work of gathering it, finding the right data set, making it available, tooling it, is kind of lost in its value if we've made it too difficult for the people that need it to understand it. And that simplicity is, I think, the point really, Ken, is it's just got to be, it could be complicated, the process that you've had to go through to bring that data together and make that data available if you've had all the work that you need to do to collect it. But actually, it's, to sort of fail at the last mile of making it simple would be a real crime, I think. And I do wonder, I feel like sometimes that our job, Ken, is that we're in that last mile of the sort of data story, and our job is to make sure that last mile of it is an experience that is easily understood by anybody and used by anybody. And I just wondered, Paul, for your community, how you were making this useful to them and making it simple. What are the ways that you're seeing is what is it you're doing that is making sure that last mile is going to drive the value?
That's an interesting one. So I would say personalizing it. So to go back to something I may or may not have said earlier, because I'm getting older, forget these things. It's that, how do I create change? Well, I need the data to be presented in a way that is meaningful to me, that makes me see the reason for that change. So really the whole big bit for us is creating ways of consuming and understanding that data that is personalized. In the same way, if you look, I mean, yes, we're all in the IT industry and we spend a lot of time talking about this stuff, but we're not the biggest consumers of data. They're the people who go, hey Siri, or hey Google, or hey whichever the other one is, what's the weather going to be? What's it like there? I mean, that to me, I've seen grow enormously in the last couple of years. The use of the assistant, it's all from watching Iron Man or whatever it is on the telly in the films, that just manipulates it and asks a question and the computer knows what the answer is. And that's where we're heading, and that's the thing that's really exciting. Where there's something, probably something Ken's created, sat in the background, working all this stuff out. But as an individual, I don't care. I don't actually care what the source is. I don't care where it comes from. I need to know it's valid and it's trusted. But I just want to be able to ask questions and it feed me with the things I want. So where we're looking and heading over the next X years is, how do we make that even more so? Yes, with the advances in AI and machine learning and easy questioning, but that interface, making it so much more personal and easy to consume.
I think it's such a brilliant point, Paul. When I think about them, I don't know how many, but I imagine hundreds of thousands, possibly, I'm scared to say even millions, of engineers and people that are behind the Alexa and Siri experiences. But at the end of the day, all of those people are ensuring that what the consumer, what the person needs is a simple question, and they get their straightforward answer very quickly. And yeah, I think that last mile for me is where all the value ultimately gets consumed and driven from, and making sure that is that's the bit we're getting right. It's certainly our obsession, Ken, and challenging ourselves and getting that last mile right. Ken, I just wanted to wrap up on this point and then maybe ask everybody to just think about, what would be the one point you would take away or would want people to take away from this. Paul, Judith, if you could think about that for a second, but just thinking about that kind of interaction between the person and whatever technology, whether it's a voice assistant or a data visualization tool like ours, that kind of human interaction. Is there one thing, simplicity you mentioned, but is there something that everybody that might be on listening to this, and our customers and partners, that you think is the kind of a real piece of advice or nugget or thought you'd like to leave us with?
I'm not going to talk about data anymore. I've decided after this call, I'm going to talk about insights. That's number one. And it's quite interesting because we had two names for Panintelligence written on the bit of paper 17 years ago, and one was Panintelligence, and one was Paninsight. So I'm now kicking myself. Yeah, I think data is everywhere. It's here to stay. A lot of the good and the bad and the ethical stuff, it's always been here. I watched a Netflix documentary about Rupert Murdoch the other day. Way before big data happened, we were being manipulated by the people who will manipulate us anyway. They'll find a way of doing it. We just got to make sure we're not part of it. But the humanization and the personalization of things is really, really important. So much tech actually gets in the way rather than just enables us. And you can see people frustrated by it. Tech that's actually made our jobs harder, or opened up more lines or distracted us more. It's about tech that reduces the distractions, lets us to focus on the important things, and enables us to one, do our job a bit better, but also socially, tech that enables better lifestyles as well. I think that's something that we should all be excited about, whilst just looking over our shoulder at the way some of it's being used, and making sure that we agree, we're happy, and we're part of the debate where we think that's wrong. And the only way to ever solve stuff where it goes wrong is to be involved in the debate and take an active role in it. I think that's what I think I've learned a lot this afternoon in summary, really.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Ken. I think just the conversation and some of the areas we've got into, I think it's felt like we've really covered a broad range of subjects around insights. And I agree, I think it should have been planning driven by insights event and probably not data. And I think there's a real evolution, right? I think going back to what Judith said about this should be insights as a new oil, we will take that away, and that will be going in the follow-up, I can assure you, Judith. But yeah, just wondered what was the thing that maybe you would take away from this, or you'd want people that are on the event to take away from today.
I think it's the importance of context. So I think we've all acknowledged that we have data in abundance. It's actually easier than you might think to have those conversations with your clients, your prospects, and there was always about the evolution of Panintelligence, and it was having those kind of very open conversations, and there will always be friendly critics. There will always be customers, there will always be prospects who you can engage in the process to help you make sense of data and kind of take you on that journey to actionable recommendations. So, of course, we would say this, wouldn't we? But for us, it's that important to build on what the data might be suggesting to you.
Thanks, Judith. So context being critical, really, to driving that sort of value and understanding and making it useful and actionable, really, which I think is, something we sort of started and come back to, but I couldn't agree more, because ultimately being able to present something simply and make it useful to people without relevant context or personalization, as Paul said, which is the future, people are going to struggle to be able to understand how they can usefully apply that, I think is talking around it is what we're saying here. And Paul, I just wondered if you could maybe wrap us up on this with a few minutes to go on what you've taken away and what you ask others to.
So I think it's something, as we've probably mentioned, we collect quite a lot of data already, having terabytes of the stuff, but that's not really what it's about. So yes, I can analyze what I've got today. The most important bit is actually we have a much longer term plan for what we know we're going to need to do to support what people, universities in our case, are going to need. So our entire development pathway, our data collection pathway, set out over the next 5 years, is about collecting and storing and categorizing and collating the right data to support the things we know we're going to need to do in 5 years' time, including the personalization and the correlation and everything else that goes with it. So I think it's great to play with data and go analyze it and go look stuff up, because we all do it. But as a business, having that plan that gives you the stages and phases, so you've got a clear foundation, then you know what you're collecting before you start trying to do stuff with it, is probably a good idea. But it's not going away, that's for sure.
No, and on the subject of planning, I think that's a really good sort of a good rounding off of the whole kind of conversation, because how useful is data planning, but how much planning really should we be doing, thinking about the future uses of data, where we need to be collecting it today to have enough of it for it to be useful tomorrow, or to apply to the new scenarios or the changes that we can see around us. And that, we've talked about change and COVID and how that's changed behaviours and patterns, and what does that mean for the organisations that are using that data, where they might need data in a different way, different information to drive change. I think, Paul, that's perfect. Planning for the data needs of tomorrow, so that you may plan better for tomorrow, is also absolutely of value, I think. I'm conscious that it's always really wonderful to give people a little bit of time back, especially when we're sat in front of screens all day, every day. I thank you to everybody who's stayed with us, listened to the conversation. If you have any questions or would like to reach out to any of the people on the call, on the webinar today, then please do get in touch with Ken or myself, and we will by all means make an introduction to Paul and Judith. Hopefully that's okay, Paul and Judith. We'll send them your way. And really appreciate everyone's participation and the questions that came through. But thank you so much for your contributions. It was a brilliant conversation. I think we covered a huge amount, and with your blessing, we'll write this up and make sure there's a summary of this that you can share and share with others, and we'll be making this available for people to watch back should they wish, should people have not been in it today. And for everybody that's still on, if there's somebody you think really would have benefited from watching this, then please look out for the email, which will have a link to the video and also the sort of follow-up summary from the event that you'll be able to share, and people will be able to watch after today's webinar. But thank you again, everybody. Really appreciate it. You're brilliant supporters of Panintelligence and everything we do, and I look forward to further conversations with you both. Take care, everyone.